Okay, welcome. Welcome back, everyone. Please take your seats. We would like to start with our next session. That is Symposium number 2, titled The Development of Epistemic and Interpersonal Trust, the Case of Dominance. The chairs of the symposium are Thomas Ganzetti from the University of Neuchâtel and Thomas Castelain from University of Girona.
Okay, hello everyone. Can you hear me? Can you hear me well also from the back of the room? Okay, nice. So welcome to this symposium session. So I'm going to just briefly introduce the speakers of this session. So the first contribution will be given by Thomas Castelain from the University of Girona, and it will focus on the relationship between trust and dominance from 3 different cultures. So the cultural aspect of the use of dominance cues in the attribution of trust. The second contribution will be given by Francesco Margoni from the University of Stavanger in Norway and the University of Oslo. And it will focus more on different types of dominance of social power, so respect-based versus fear-based social power. And then I will give the last contribution, talking about the role of dominance cues when other socially relevant cues are present, such as the majority's opinion. There is a change in the structure of our symposium, because unfortunately our discussant, Melissa Koenig, couldn't join us. So what we're going to do is to have more time for the presentations, and then we're going to have a joint Q&A session at the end. So the presentations will be about 18 minutes, and then I'd like to ask you one thing. If you have any questions which are strictly related to the study, so clarification questions and very straightforward questions, you can ask them at the end of each talk. If you have more elaborated questions, please keep them for the joint Q&A session at the end. So thank you very much, and now, Thomas, you can give the first talk, so the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Okay. Can you hear me well? In the back? Yeah? Okay, great. Okay, so today I would like to share with you a series of studies my colleagues and I conducted in order to determine if children take dominance into account when evaluating testimonies. So we acquire a large number of our beliefs through communication. However, we cannot blindly rely on others' testimony. People have various levels of knowledge and expertise, and they rarely have perfectly aligned incentives. As a result, we can expect humans to be endowed with mechanisms of epistemic vigilance that filter communicated information, so most beneficial information is accepted and most harmful information is rejected. Some of these mechanisms pay attention to the content. Is it plausible? Is it supported by good arguments? Others to the source. Is she trustworthy? Is she competent? For instance, you would be more likely to trust your medical doctor talking about a particular disease than your postman. Besides, when an information is communicated to you, it is checked against your background of intention and beliefs. So if you find some incoherence, you may reject the message. The mechanisms of epistemic vigilance seem to develop relatively early. Several recent works showed that preschoolers use different types of cue to decide whom to trust, like accuracy or benevolence. Even infants are more inclined to take into account a new piece of information if it does not conflict with their beliefs or if it's come from a confident informant. Complementarily, several studies have shown that Occidental children from an early age identify the dominance from different cues like physical strength or resources and make inferences based on dominance. For instance, dominance is stable over time. However, less is known if they use this cue when evaluating whom to trust, and if culture can impact how they evaluate dominance. On the one hand, anthropological, sociological, and linguistic data suggest that culture could affect how children treat dominance. In particular, parenting styles in traditional societies rely more on hierarchy than argumentation when we compare them to Western cultures. There is also comparatively little talk between children and their caregivers, and parents ask few questions to their children, relying more on imperatives when addressing to them. On the other hand, it has been suggested that in vertical individualist cultures, such as the US or France, and vertical collectivist cultures, such as Japan, the attitude towards dominance and subordination differ. In vertical individualist cultures, people often want to become distinguished and acquire status, and they did this in individual competition with others. By contrast, in vertical collectivist cultures, the conquest of power at the level of the individual is much less fostered, and communication often conveys explicit signs of subordination or respect, like bowing. So these cross-cultural differences observed in relationship between adults are mirrored by differences in the way children are treated. In vertical individualist cultures, a number of cultural practices tend to individualize children and to foster autonomy. By contrast, in Japan, the concept of ensei, which is at the core of the Japanese education at home and school, promotes relational self-improvement, and humility. So the aim of the series of experiments we conducted was to determine if preschoolers take dominance into account when deciding whom to trust, and study if culture can impact the valuing of dominance. So to do so, we created an experiment based on a selective trust task that we conducted in 3 different cultural contexts. Our participants were Maya indigenous children from Guatemala, and French and Japanese middle-class children. So while there is some differences in the 3 studies for the sake of the presentation, I will focus on the aspects that are common to all 3 studies and present the result of the 5-year-old children, which is common to all 3 samples. But first, let me introduce you to Maria and her hen. So Maria's hen often escaped, and the task of the children was to help Maria to find her hen. So as an anecdote, in France and in Japan, children had to help find a missing dog, but we have to change it in Guatemala since dogs in this particular context are not considered as pet, they're stray dog, so nobody really cares when the dog went. So the experiment was divided in 2 phases, an induction phase and a test phase. So in the induction phase, the hierarchical relation was established. The same character won 2 games, winning the fight or getting the object. In the test phase, children were presented with the same protagonist, merely pointing in different directions and saying the hen went this way. And the children were asked, according to you, where did the hen went? So our results indicate that children from France and Guatemala endorse the testimony of the dominant character. So based on this set of data, we could propose 2 potential hypotheses for children's use of dominance to select testimony. The first hypothesis is social. So children might seek to ingratiate with the dominant. In general, it is more important to be seen in a positive light with dominance than by subordinates. So recent data could support this interpretation. It has been shown that children defer to the majority consensus, even when this consensus runs against their own accurate perception. A second possible interpretation is linked to competence. So in a recent study, Serra and collaborators presented to 3 to 5 years old French children 2 characters marked as being a dominant and a subordinate by their bodily postures and by the action of respectively giving orders and complying with orders. When asked which of the 2 characters would win in a nondescript game of skills, children were more likely to select the dominant. This result suggests that preschoolers consider dominants to be more competent than subordinates, even in domains that do not directly involve dominance, such as a game of skills. This interpretation is also consistent with research showing that adults tend to attribute more competence to individual, high in trait dominance. So children might use a heuristic similar to that used by adults and attribute by default competence to dominant irrespectively of their actual competence. However, the result obtained in Japan invite us to think further on how children use this cue when evaluating whom to trust. Indeed, Japanese preschoolers significantly endorsed the testimony of the subordinate character. So when we conduct the same experiment with university students, we ask them to explain their choices in order to have more information, and we discover that because the dominance was induced by physical force, the dominant was considered as an aggressive individual, and so, according to local norms, untrustworthy. Complementary, a recent study showed that children from Norway were equally likely to choose the dominant and subordinate agents. So altogether, those results can be interpreted in at least 2 ways. So first, it is possible that there is a universal adaptative early developing tendency to value dominance, a tendency suggested, for instance, by the strong liking of dominance displayed by 2 years old in other studies. This tendency, however, might be superseded by local cultural norms, such as the norms of Japanese culture or equalitarian norms in Norway. A second possible interpretation is that the result obtained in Guatemala and France can be explained by the local cultural norms or vertical cultures. In this case, there might be no universal tendency to value either dominance or subordinates. There might even be a universal tendency to value subordinate that is superseded by local cultural norms. So these experiments offer evidence of cultural variability in early valuing of dominance, suggesting that we should be cautious in generalizing the conclusion of studies in this topic conducted with children from a unique sample. As an interesting avenue for further research would be to look at how early these differences emerge, and also possible differences in the valuing of dominance depending on its nature, for instance, physical power versus decisional power or leadership, a topic that Francesco will discuss in the next presentation. So to conclude, it was quicker than expected. I would like to acknowledge the contribution of all the people who made this research, in particular all the communities, school, teachers, parents, and children who agreed to participate in our weird experiment. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, hello everyone. So I'm going to present a study, and the title of my presentation is What to Believe, the Relevance of Nonverbal Consensual Cues and Dominance Relationships in Testimony Evaluation. It's a study that I conducted with Gökhan Gönül and Fabrice Clément at the University of Neuchâtel in Switzerland. So to give you an overview, as Francesco and Thomas highlighted with their talks, previous research displayed how young children and adults are sensitive to dominance cues, and how these dominance cues might be used to attribute trust when acquiring information from external sources of information. But it's also true that there are other socially relevant cues for epistemic trust, such as the majority's opinion. So the goal of the present study was to put dominance and consensus in contrast and to see which one is more relevant when evaluating testimony. So I'd like to spend a few words about the role of consensus and, in epistemic trust in preschoolers. So previous studies displayed that preschoolers, so 3 to 5-year-olds, tend to endorse the testimony of a consensual group over the testimony of a lone dissenter in an object labeling task, like the one that you can see here in the picture. So when there were unfamiliar objects on the table and an interviewer asked to point to the object name, for instance, Modi, just to use a pseudonym, then 3 people pointed at one object and only one lone dissenter pointed to another one. And children tended to trust and to identify the Modi as the object which was pointed at by the 3 informants here. It's also interesting that the effect of consensus is so strong that children tend to endorse the majority's opinion even when the group proved to be inaccurate. So when there was, in a previous task, so in a familiarization phase, they demonstrated inaccuracy, and they still went with the majority's opinion instead with a lone inaccurate dissenter. Sorry. One thing that is important to note is that 5- and 6-year-olds tend to be less influenced by consensus. So it seems that from 5 years of age, there is more resistance to consensus. And for instance, children tend to prefer to rely on their perceptual evidence if it is in contrast with the majority's opinion. But I'd like to focus on one specific operationalization of consensual cues, which is nonverbal displays of assent and dissent. So this is a paradigm used by Fusaro and Harris in 2008. So this was an object labeling task. You can see the interviewer here in the middle. These were the two informants. So the interviewer placed an object on the table and then asked one at a turn, oh, what do you think is the name of this object? And the two informants provided contrasting claims. But while they did so, these two bystanders displayed approval or disapproval with their claims. So all the time, for instance, for this informant, they nodded their head in sense of approval. With the other one, they shook their head like, no, this is totally inaccurate. And what they found is that 4-year-olds were really sensitive to this nonverbal assent and dissent. In fact, they tended to endorse the testimony of the informant receiving approval from the bystanders. Now, these nonverbal displays of assent and dissent might be interpreted in two ways. As regarding the quality of the information, so this is good information, this is faulty information, or as signals about the reliability of the source. So this informant has accurate beliefs, this informant has inaccurate beliefs. So going back to the study. So what we wanted to do, as I said, was to put dominance and consensus in contrast to see which one is more relevant. So the question is, do humans rely more on nonverbal consensual cues or on dominance cues when evaluating testimony? And furthermore, is there any different type of sensitivity for these cues between adults and children? And here we investigated with preschoolers, so 3 to 5-year-olds. And also, if this sensitivity to these cues changes when there is different type of dominance. So when there is a leader or a bully. And then the definition of leader and bully is very similar to what Francesco explained in his presentation. So legitimate power or power acquired through the use of physical dominance. So what we hypothesized was that, adults and children would rely more on consensus than on dominance. And then children would rely on consensual cues even more than adults because they would be more sensitive as displayed by previous research. And even if leaders might be more competent because of this legitimate power, we still thought that consensual cues would be more relevant in both cases. So experiment 1 created a contrast between consensual cues and dominance cues by using two existing paradigms, so Bernard and colleagues and Fusaro and Harris. And there was an induction phase. I will show you anyway an example of the story in the induction phase and of the trials. This is just to have a general idea of the experiment. So one character was identified as being the dominant with physical power. So experiment 1 was about a bully. And then we had two testimony tasks in which the dominant and the subordinate from the induction phase provided contrasting claims. And then participants were asked to endorse the claims of one over the other informant. And while they did so, exactly like in the paradigm I showed about nonverbal displays of assent and dissent, two bystanders displayed agreement or disagreement with their claims. So by nodding and displaying approval, or by shaking their head, displaying disapproval. Our sample consists of 75 participants, so we collected data between Switzerland and Italy. So we had both French-speaking participants and Italian-speaking participants. So we had 43 adults and 32 preschoolers, 3 to 5-year-olds. So just to give the overview of the structure, as I said, there was an induction phase. So in the induction phase, we had two stories with the use of two videos in which one character prevailed over another one when they had contrasting goals. When they had, they engage in a physical contest for a desired good. I will show you the video, and one of them prevailed using physical power. After one character was identified as being the dominant, we had a semantic task, so an object labeling task, in which the two informants named unfamiliar objects, and then a localization task for the episodic domain, in which there were like two boxes of different colors on the table, and they had to find, for instance, a pen, and the interviewer asked, oh, where is the pen? And they provided contrasting claims, like saying, oh, for me it's in the yellow box, for me it's in the green box. And between the two tasks, we had an additional story, exactly like the one in the induction phase, especially for children to help them to keep track of the dominance relationship. So what were these stories about? Well, we had a chocolate story, in which basically participants were told, oh, there is just one remaining bar of chocolate. And we had two names for these characters, Charles and Pierre, and we say, Charles and Pierre both want to take this bar of chocolate. Let's see what happens. And they engage in a physical contest, and one of them just obtains the chocolate bar. Very similarly, there was a story in which they wanted to watch different programs on the television, and they fought for the remote control. And then the cookie story is like the chocolate story, but this time there was a cookie. This is an example of the cookie story. So you can see Charles and Pierre, wonderful actors, and you can see what happens here. So they want to take the chocolate bar, and one of them just pushes the other way and keeps the chocolate. He's very proud of his chocolate, and he's very happy of having the chocolate. And then, as I said, there were two tasks, but why two tasks? Mostly because most of the studies which investigate consensus focus on object labeling tasks, but there is a conventional component in the use of a word in a community. So it's intuitive, it makes sense to trust the majority when it comes up to the use of a word to refer to an object. So we wanted also to have an event-specific task in which they had to just indicate where is an object, where there is no conventional component. So these were the two scenarios, they were exactly like in the Fusaro and Harris. So we have the two characters from the induction phase, the dominant and the subordinate. This was the interviewer, and the two bystanders. And so this was a semantic task. The video is in French. So basically what happens is that the interviewer places the object on the table and then asks, oh, what do you think is the name for this object? And they provide contrasting claims.
Regardez l'objet bizarre que j'ai trouvé. À ton avis, quel est le nom de cet objet?
Je pense que c'est un ripoll.
À ton avis, quel est le nom de cet objet?
Je pense que c'est un vitral.
Probably a vitral, right? And then for the episodic task, so same exact scenario, but this time the interviewer will ask, oh, we have to find the pen. Well, where do you think is the pen? In the green box or in the yellow box? And then they're gonna indicate, two different ones.
Où est le stylo? Tu penses que le stylo est dans le sac jaune ou dans le sac vert?
Je pense que le stylo est dans le sac vert.
Yeah, definitely.
Tu penses que le stylo est dans le sac jaune ou dans le sac vert?
Je pense que le stylo est dans le sac jaune.
So then participants were asked, oh, where do you think is the pen? In the green box or in the yellow box? Or what do you think is the name of the object? Ripoll, like Charles said, or a vitral, like Pierre said. So what we did was to assign two scores to participants. A consensus score, so we gave them 1 point every time they chose the claim given by the informant with the bystander's approval, regardless of the fact they were the dominant or the subordinate. And then we had the dominant score in which they receive 1 point every time they endorse the claim given by the dominant, regardless they were receiving approval or disapproval from the bystanders. So there were 4 trials, so the maximum point for each score was 8. Just one thing that I want to make really clear. The two bystanders endorse the claims of the informants half of the time for one and half of the time for the other. So it means that, I wanted to be very clear about this. So as I said, there were 4 trials. So in 2 trials, the bystanders endorse the claim given by the dominant. In 2 trials, they endorse the claim given by the subordinate. And the same here. So they alternated their judgments. Okay. So as I was saying, the maximum points for each score was 8, and 4 represented the level of chance. Here you can see the results for adults. So, our hypothesis was that adults will rely more on consensus than on dominance, and what we found was a strong effect of consensus, and it was above the level of chance. While it was not the case for the choice for the dominant, which was not significantly different from the level of chance, and when performing the bias test, we also found substantial evidence that it would be at the level of chance. And then we compared their 2 scores to see if they relied more on consensus or on dominance, and we found that they actually relied more on consensus than on dominance. Here you can see the results for children. So they display the same tendency with a very strong effect of the bystanders' assent and dissent, and their choice for consensus was significantly above the level of chance. Here you can see only the non-parametric results, but the parametric results were the same. We just wanted to present these ones. And the choice for dominant was not above the level of chance, and again, it was, the bias factor indicates that it was at the level of chance. It's likely it was at the level of chance. And when comparing the 2 scores, we found that they relied on consensus more than on dominance. So here you can see a comparison between children and adults' reliance on consensus. And we found that there was a significant difference in that children tended to rely on consensus more than adults, as stated by our hypothesis. So what do these findings tell us? Well, first of all, that there is a strong effect on epistemic judgments of assent and dissent, both in adults and children, and that they are more relevant than dominance cues. And that children are sensitive to consensual cues even more than adults. And what about dominance at the level of chance? We had two possible interpretations. The first one is that dominance was simply outranked. So when there is a majority's opinion, dominance cues are not that relevant, and the focus is just on consensus. Another possibility is that, a bully is a malevolent individual. And previous research showed that malevolence is not a cue for trustworthiness. People tend to mistrust malevolent individuals. So what we wanted to do was also to see what happens when there is a different type of dominance. And this is exactly what we wanted to do with experiment 2. So experiment 2 was exactly the same design, the same structure, but just with a different type of dominance induced. So we had the induction phase, but this time the dominant character was identified as being the dominant based on prestige cues. So legitimate power, as the one that Francesco explained before. And then we had the two testimony tasks, in which, again, they were exactly the same. So the object labeling task and the localization task. So this, again, the structure. What changed was just in the induction phase, and of course, the additional story. So this is an example of the leader condition. So this time you see, they just give access to the desired good to the dominant individual, who is very, very happy about the cookie. And then the task, I will not show them again because they were the same. And the sample for this participant, we are still completing data collection. We have 58 participants. This time, all of them from Switzerland. So all of them were French-speaking participants, 38 adults, and 20 preschoolers. But the preliminary results that I'm going to show you are just with 3 to 5-year-olds, because we are still missing 5-year-olds. And our target is to have 38 of them. So these are the preliminary results for experiment 2. We found the same tendency as experiment 1. So again, the choice for consensus was significantly above the level of chance, with a strong effect of consensual cues. And this time, the choice for the dominant was not above the level of chance, but it was slightly below. So, but here I think that the focus is on the strong effect of bystanders' assent and dissent. And then when comparing their two scores for consensus and for dominance, we found that they relied on consensual cues more than on dominance cues. And for children, again, choice for consensus significantly above the level of chance, with a strong effect. And the choice for the dominant was at the level of chance. So not above, again, even when the dominant was a leader. And here is the comparison between their consensus score and their dominant score, and they relied on consensual cues more than on dominance cues. So what we can say is that even with a different type of dominance, we have the same results from experiment 1, or at least, we have to complete data collection with children, but the effect seems to be very strong even when the dominant is a leader. And dominance at the level of chance or below is something that we might discuss now, also in the Q&A session. I'd like also to know what Francesco and Thomas think about it, because I've just seen the tendency displayed by Francesco of children tending to rely more on bullies than on dominance, especially at a young age. So that's really interesting. And for our general discussion, what we can say is for sure that these nonverbal displays of assent and dissent strongly influence our epistemic judgments. And that they are definitely more relevant than dominance cues when the two of them are put in contrast. I explained why we had two tasks. I didn't mention any difference because there was no effect of type of task. So what we did was not only to replicate what found by Fusar and Harris, but also to extend it to the episodic domain, so to event-specific tasks. So the conventional component is not a good explanation for following consensus in this case. And about the interpretation of assent and dissent, well, as I explained, in our case, bystanders alternated their judgments. So they did not consistently and all the time agreed only with one informant. So children and adults interpreted them as being related to the quality of the information, because there was not an informant which could be perceived as being more reliable, because they followed just this assent and dissent based on the quality of the information. And about, this is one point, because what we found with some questions that for adults were more, was easier to explicitly recognize who was the dominant. So we had many control questions at the end of the experiment. And what we think is that children had only an implicit understanding of dominance, because some of them were not explicitly identifying the dominant as the one that we wanted to. But it's also true that in this case, in the other questions, they recognize the dominant one as being the stronger, and there was also maybe a component of the question used to ask who was the dominant, because previous studies, especially in the French-speaking language, use the word chef, and it was very easy for children to understand who was the chef. When we were asking Italian children, it's more difficult to come up with a word that they could understand, because we have dominante, or who is in charge, chi è in carica. So maybe it was also how the question was formulated. And in any case, the question to the dominance recognition did not influence the scores. So, and then I think we don't have much time now if we want to have the Q&A session, but we also found an age effect. It was not completely in line with what's shown by previous literature. I'd like to thank all the kindergartens, children, and people who took part to the study, the other authors of the study, Gökhan Gönül and Fabrice Clément, and all the other wonderful people from the Cognitive Science Department in Neuchâtel. You should visit Neuchâtel. Good cheese, good chocolate, a wonderful lake. Yeah, advertising. And of course, thank you for your attention. Here you can find a QR code to the pre-registration on the Open Science Framework, where you can find all the details about the study. Everything was pre-registered there. So thank you very much.
So we have 2 minutes for a question, and then for Thomas specifically for this talk, and then we can open the Q&A for all the 3 presenters.
Mine's more general, sorry.
Very nice talk. Just one question I have. I feel I would be cautious about the strength of the consensus effect in the following sense, that the background guys who gave the consensus also saw the object and could have known its name. Now, what if they would be blocked for seeing the object, but they would show consensus with the informer, and then you would have the 2 types of dominance, leadership cue and bully cue. So, so that would be a consensus with the source of the information, and you wouldn't attribute necessarily epistemic, access to the knowledge and the name that all speakers share.
Okay, that's a good point, but it's also true that when we introduced the task, we explained that this interviewer, we introduced her as being a friend of this group, just found some very strange and bizarre objects, like in the object labeling task. So that was actually the first time that also the bystanders were seeing the object, and they just have to help her to know what was the name. And the same, I mean, some people ask, what can the people in the background see what there is in the 2 bags? And the point was no. I mean, they were close, and they have to see what there is inside. So. But thank you for your question.
Okay, great. Thank you, Thomas.